All right, in this video, we're going to be discussing the cross-cutting concepts and the issues surrounding this dimension of the next generation science standards. Specifically, the over-reliance on these cross-cutting concepts that are preventing students from understanding the content in a more rigorous manner. Now, throughout this video, I'm going to be explaining why we need to not eliminate these cross-cutting concepts, but reposition them more as an application of knowledge, much like engineering. Now, quick introduction. My name is Nathan Dolence. I'm an associate professor of science education at the University of Louisiana here in Lafayette. Now, these cross-cutting concepts have been defined and described in a variety of different ways, okay? Now, the original document that led to the next generation science standards, called the Framework for K-12 Science Education, describes these concepts in this way. And I'm just going to read this verbatim. This is on page 233 of the document. It says, cross-cutting concepts have value because they provide students with connections and intellectual tools that are related across differing areas of disciplinary content, and can enrich their application of practices and their understanding of core ideas. All right. Now, you can look at or find different definitions of them. In fact, if you just go to Gemini AI right now, they describe cross-cutting concepts as overarching concepts or ideas that connect content across different domains, like from biology to chemistry, chemistry to physics, physics to biology, and so on, okay? Now, here's a quick definition of what these are, okay? Cross-cutting concepts, they're just themes. That's all they are. They're just themes. And when you start to think about them, it kind of clears up a little bit of the jargon that I just shared with you, okay? They're just themes. That's all they are. Again, a theme connects content across science domains. Now, a lot of NGSS proponents, they talk about these cross-cutting concepts as ways in which we can help students think like experts, all right? And they often cite this study that was done, I believe, in the 1970s, where they had grandmaster chess players and novice chess players look at a chessboard that was midway through the game. And what they found is that the grandmaster chess players were looking at the board, looking for strategies, right? And the novices were looking at, not for strategies, but more on the individual pieces. And that's natural, right? Because a grandmaster has a lot of expertise. They've played the game quite often, and they're obviously looking at it in a much higher level, right? And of course, a novice or a beginner hasn't ascended to that level. Okay, so a lot of, again, NGSS proponents and ideologues say like, well, we want our students to start thinking like experts. So actually, that's a really good place to start. So let's take a moment to step back from these cross-cutting concepts and think about what happens to an individual as they ascend to a higher level of expertise. What happens to them neurologically? All right, so when someone starts out, any individual starts out in a field, okay? Pick any industry, any field, any topic, any domain, and let's just, for sake of argument, let's say they're starting out and studying physics, okay? Let's keep it in science, okay? And they start studying and they are starting to read. Maybe they're attending a lecture and they're taking notes and they're organizing their notes and they're reading more. And again, they're trying to write things down and memorize things, and maybe they're practicing problems and they're grinding through this process, okay? Now, over the years, through this reading and writing and practicing and memorization and all of these retention exercises, they start to build a large base of knowledge, okay? naturally because they're just studying more and more and more content, okay? Now, as this base of knowledge grows and the individual starts to rise to a higher level of expertise, what naturally happens in a person's brain is that they start to offload information that they deem unnecessary, okay? And in this process of offloading the intricate details, they form what are called chunks or blocks of knowledge, all right? Now, the purpose of this in forming these blocks or chunks of knowledge is to make room for more knowledge, okay? It's an organization. So for all you type A people out there, you love this, right? So you're organizing, right, things in your brain, right? So to make room for more information, okay? Now, there are two things that you need to remember about this overall process, okay? Number one, while this process is a natural process and it's an objective process, meaning it happens to a lot of people that start to build a large base of knowledge, the chunks of knowledge or the blocks of knowledge are unique to the individual. That means that if you and I were spent years and years and years studying physics, right, this topic, and we're studying, we're practicing, we're memorizing, we're even sharing notes, right? The blocks of knowledge that you form are going to be unique to you. And they're going to be different than the blocks of knowledge that I form because we live in our own subjective bubbles, okay? Now, so that's something, while the overall process is objective, the outcome is subjective, blocks of knowledge, right? Because what you deem important in your life is different from what I deem important in my life, naturally, right? Now, the second thing that you need to remember is that as a person ascends to a higher level of expertise and becomes a so-called expert, right, they have this unique ability to remember what they don't remember, okay? Because they've offloaded a lot of information, right? They don't need to know the intricate details, right? So this is really important. They remember what they don't remember because they spent a ton of time grinding through the intricate details of the definitions and the mechanisms and the equations. And now they've ascended to a level where, like, you don't need to know the intricate details. You might not remember the intricate details of Ohm's law, or let's say another domain, like you might not remember the intricate details of the Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium equation, but I do remember that it talks about allele frequency and genotype of frequency in a particular ecosystem, right? So, but these, I'm not saying I'm an expert, by the way, but what's great about, again, individuals that rise to a higher level of expertise, they can access that information quickly, okay? They remember what they don't remember, right? So those two pieces of information are really important about an individual rising to a higher level of expertise. Now, let's bring in these cross-cutting concepts and talk about them in relationship to what we just learned about what happens to someone when they are rising to a higher level of expertise. With the next generation science standards, remember these cross-cutting concepts are themes, okay? And they've elevated these themes to be on the same level of value as the practices, the doing part of science, and the content, in other words, the DCI, okay? So they're on the same level of value. That's why they call it 3D learning. You're supposed to do science and learn the content and integrate these themes into this overall, process and content. Okay. So with this 3D learning and elevating these cross-cutting concept themes to be of the same level of importance and value, what they've done is that the next generation science standards and their developers, they assume that a K-12 student can do this process of becoming an expert in reverse. You're starting these K-12 students at an expert level, right? You're at a thematic level, okay? And you're forcing them to have these themes in their brain. And they're trying to onload information to access this large base of knowledge, okay? But what we see is that the cross-cutting concepts are not going anywhere, and they're onloading information and to try to access this base of knowledge, and we don't see this base of knowledge. It's a patchwork. And this is why actually previous critiques of the next generation science standards, say from the Fordham Institute or the National Association of Scholars and hundreds of other academics, have said that there's a lot of missing content, or the content is described on a more conceptual or thematic level. And there's hardly any mathematics in these standards. And this is potentially a reason why we see the content described in this way, in a more thematic way, because we're forcing these expert themes onto students, K-12 students, okay? If students really want to access this core foundation of content, what they would have to do is they would have to actually strip away these themes, all right, in order to access the rigorous definitions, mechanisms, and equations, okay? Just think about this. Think about any definition any mathematical formula in physics, like work equals force times distance, right? Or power equals force over time, right? I think that's right. So, right, those intricate details and definitions and equations, those have nothing to do with, the phospholipid bilayer of a cell, right? No, because you would have to, cognitively speaking, a student would have to strip away these themes to access the content. And that's really hard to do, cognitively speaking, especially for a novice. Now, going back to the logical order, an individual that has first studied the content in a rigorous manner, right? They can naturally understand these themes, right? And they can go in and out of the rigorous content and the themes. But a novice can't, or it's harder for them, okay? Because they believe that these themes are the core content. No, they're not. So that is a problem. Sometimes when an individual rises to a higher level of expertise and they become a so-called expert, sometimes this happens without even them knowing it. And they have really good intentions, okay? But oftentimes an expert will get to a higher level of expertise and they'll look upon the world and they'll say to themselves and to others, we need to look at the world in this way, okay? Well, in doing so, they sometimes forget about how they themselves got to that higher level of expertise, how they themselves went through the grind of studying and memorizing and knowing the intricate details and definitions of everything, right? And in forgetting their own process of getting to this higher level of expertise, they have figuratively pulled the ladder up behind them, preventing others from getting up there. Now, you might be asking, Dr. Dolans, are you doing this to us? Well, full transparency here, I'm just trying to get to streamline these standards, and my desire or my only goal is to have students understand science content in the most rigorous way possible. After listening to this becoming an expert or doing this expert levels of expertise in reverse, you might be thinking, okay, Dr. Dolan's, you're thinking about this way too much. And you know what? You might be right. You might be right. But let's actually now look at these cross-cutting concepts in a more practical manner. So I work with a lot of teachers and future teachers and current teachers, and a positive step in their growth is to look at these themes and understand that you can actually control for the content and start changing them out, swapping them, okay? Now, when you look at a next generation science standards, there is one practice, one content, and one theme, okay? But like I just said, a positive growth in the teacher's development is for them to see that there's a little bit of flexibility with these next generation science standards. You can start swapping out the themes, not just do the one that's listed there, okay? So for example, let's say you're teaching about ecosystems, right? And well, you could look at it from a patterns theme or a cause and effect theme or a energy and matter theme, and multiple themes that they have listed there, right? While that is a positive step in a teacher's growth, right, and becoming a dynamic science teacher, the teacher and educator will be left with a question, or it will lead to a question, okay? And the question will be, well, what theme is best for this particular content, right? So let me step away from this discussion here for a second and note that the next generation science standards, they don't promote, overall, they don't promote this iterative scientific process, okay, as a way of knowing. That is, they don't promote this nice scientific iterative cycle of a question, a way of gathering data, and then you make meaning out of that through reasoning skills to construct knowledge. And you cycle through that over and over and over, okay? And they've done, and I've described it in other posts on X, where, again, they fragment this overall iterative process as a way of knowing. And the concern there is because they don't promote this, teachers are going to be left, going back to this discussion, they're going to be left discussing, just swapping out these different themes. And again, while that is a positive growth, they're going to be stuck. They're going to stop questioning. And they're going to be stuck within revolving around these different themes, which is what we call a linguistic trap. Okay? They're only discussing or having discourse-based activities looking at the practices and the content through these various themes. However, if you understand this iterative process as a way of knowing, you begin to understand that science is not interested in a theme, okay? A frame of mind, a lens, a filter. Science, yes, it's interested in what's inside of a theme, but also what's outside of a theme, okay? And so when you move beyond these themes, you really get into the rigorous definitions and the content that you want, well, at least I hope you want, from your students to learn, okay? So nothing wrong with themes, but again, you don't start with themes, okay? Themes come later. Okay, let's look at another kind of practical level angle of these cross-cutting concepts. Now, oftentimes, educators and teachers, they confuse these themes with science processing skills. Well, what are science processing skills? Well, science processing skills are actually part of this iterative scientific process, okay, of questioning, gathering data in a variety of different ways, and then making meaning out of that data through reasoning to construct knowledge. So we talk about questioning skills. We talk about how these questioning skills lead into different ways of collecting data through observations, through comparisons, through measuring and counting, through testing variables, right? We're trying to have students gather as much data as possible, right? And to kind of finalize this one iteration of this overall scientific process as a way of knowing, we talk about reasoning skills, right? And so these skills help keep this cycle moving, okay? They're actually part of what the original intentions of the next generation science standards were, right? To do science, right? And so they keep this cycle going, okay? Now, comparing these skills to cross-cutting concepts are themes. They're more static. When I say that they're static, they actually slow this iterative cycle down, the process of doing science. Whereas the science processing skills, they basically grease the wheel here, right? Of this iterative process as a way of knowing. The themes act as more of a tangent. They actually slow this iterative process of science down because, again, they're static themes. They don't promote the doing of science. They take you out of this iterative process as a way of knowing, of questioning, gathering data, and making meaning out of your data through reasoning skills to construct knowledge, to take you out and go off on a tangent for a brief moment in time and basically grind this iterative cycle to a halt, okay? And have you talk about whatever is happening or the content on some sort of thematic level, right? Now, initially you might think, well, isn't comparing and patterns similar? Isn't testing variables and cause and effect similar? Yes, but you wouldn't want to start off with patterns, right? You never want to start off with patterns. That means that there's an assumption already in this overall scientific process. No, that would lead you into some problems. You're making assumptions if you start with a pattern. You're actually increasing bias if you start with a theme of a pattern. No, you work your way up to understanding patterns. You don't start with patterns, okay? And all of these themes, again, nothing wrong with them. They develop later after content mastery. All right, the last point that I want to make here is revisiting a point that I made earlier about this, what happens to an individual as they're rising to a higher level of expertise. All right, after studying the content in a rigorous manner over years, they start to offload information and they form these blocks of knowledge. Well, and those blocks of knowledge, remember, are subjective, meaning they're unique to the individual. Now, because the next generation science standards, they've mandated these themes, what they've done is that they've actually slapped a label on these blocks of knowledge. The blocks of knowledge are the themes, okay? And in doing so, they've actually accidentally standardized subjectivity, okay? Now, in other words, they're requiring these themes, okay? Now, that's actually very restrictive in nature because who's to say in the future with new innovations and new discoveries that new themes won't be formed, right? And who's to say that an individual can't form their own themes, right? So these themes, I know the intentions of the next generation science standards were to have a common language, but in reality, not all experts think the same way, right? They might have some common characteristics, but in the end, they don't all think the same way. This brings us to the final point here about these cross-cutting concepts and what to do with these, okay? Well, again, as I just mentioned a moment ago, the next generation science standards, they had really good intentions in trying to incorporate these themes and a common language, but it's actually been proven difficult to implement something that is ultimately subjective, okay? So rather than mandate them or elevating them to a level of value with the doing part of science, right? The practices and even the content, which is the most important part, right? These themes, these cross-cutting concepts, should be repositioned more as an application of knowledge, much like engineering, okay? So after students have used this scientific process to construct knowledge, and they've gone through retention exercises to, ensure that the knowledge isn't just fleeting, it actually becomes long-term knowledge, and they've mastered it, then students should use this information, right? Or apply it, right? And there are many different ways of applying knowledge. One of them, of course, is what we're talking about here, is to apply it to a theme, okay? That way, they understand, they have the roots, they have the foundation of the content, and they understand that the theme is one way in which to look at it, at the content, but you can fluctuate between a variety of themes or no themes at all, right? So something to just keep in mind when we're talking about these cross-cutting concepts and how to implement them. I hope this video has actually cleared up some misconceptions about them and provided some insight on actually how to use them in the most effective way, but still focuses on students understanding the content in the most rigorous way possible. All right, thanks for listening. Take care.